It is a student who introduces our speaker today. This man is my teacher. I wanted to introduce him because of that and because any introduction or dealing with him presents certain pitfalls that a grown-up can best handle if anyone can handle them. Professor Jaffa is a famous conservative who is often critical of other conservatives. I am perhaps the most experienced man on earth in dealing with that problem, and I deal with it the best way possible, which is badly. But on the other hand, it happens that in those respects, I am on his side, and I'll explain that just for a minute. To you students, I'm going to tell you what kind of teacher he is. My fondness for him starts with that. I met him in August of 1974, 29 years ago. I arrived in his home to pick him up for the first class of my career in graduate school. His arm was in a sling. He'd fallen off his bicycle. I learned that if you wanted to get to know him, you could write a really good paper, but it had to be brief, which is a very difficult thing to do, and then he would take notice of you, or you could take up bicycle racing. That's hard to do too, but even if you do it in a mediocre way, if you have your heart in it, he'll like you for it. So I did that. He wasn't ready for class. He asked Peter Schramm, now my brother-in-law, what time the class was to be and what the class was to be about. I won't say he's the best organized teacher I ever had. We started reading Aristotle's Ethics. In the first sentence, there are 4 words for human activity. In Greek, I can tell you what they are now and their definitions as well as I could back then, and it's 29 years later. Praxis, prohairesis, dunamos, and techne. And we spent about 4 weeks finding out what those words meant, and the fact that they describe every kind of human activity that is voluntary. And Aristotle says in that first sentence that every voluntary human action aims for the good. And so the good is the thing we need to know how to define. In the second half of the class, we read maybe 8 more pages in the book. The book has 10 books, and we didn't get all the way through book 1. But we thought we knew at the end what was the problem of defining what is the good for the human being and how that relates to human action. I liked it because it was a feeder of high ambition and service, and because it equipped one to talk about the most important things in a certain way. I wasn't very good at it, but I thought I was. For that, one accumulates a debt to a teacher. Professor Jaffa is an important man for other reasons than that, but it's connected to this idea of the good that he defends. He is probably most famous in public life for writing a certain sentence in a speech that he wrote for Barry Goldwater. Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in pursuit of justice is no virtue. Now, there are not 10 college campuses in the world where that sentence would be applauded. And you know, it was a disaster, many people think, for Goldwater that he said that sentence. But it's an interesting thing that at the 1984 Republican convention, Ronald Reagan, who was also a figure in the 1964 race, had that sentence repeated at the convention on the platform by Barry Goldwater. So perhaps it was not so much a disaster as it was a long-term victory. Professor Jaffa knows his Aristotle and his Thomas Aquinas and his Plato, and he knows America. And he sees in America an unbroken line that goes from George Washington to Abraham Lincoln. He thinks America is the greatest country within the context of the discovery of philosophy in Athens and the birth of universal monotheism in Jerusalem. And he is an enemy of anyone who says otherwise. And it does not make any difference which Supreme Court upon which they sit, or which movement of which they are a part. If they differ with him on that, they differ with him on the most important thing. He does not deny that some of the people of whom he is critical have done wonderful and even vital service for our country, but his argument has always been that that thing is central. It is the cord one plucks to touch America. It is the thing that ennobles it and makes it great. I've asked myself, why have I been loyal to him? I grew up in the South. My dad's a retired school teacher. I grew up in, and now I have, a Christian family. This man is a Northerner and a Jew. When I was young, what I thought I liked about him the best was that there were these high things one could come to understand and do something about them. But in my maturity, I keep that thought, but I add to it another. My father taught me that the greatness of this country is that it treats ordinary folk like him as well as kings, or maybe better than kings, because it's a questionable thing to be a king. And my mother always said, we taught them right from wrong. She actually never did. But she knew that those were solid things and everyone knew what they were. When you get to college, those things become very complicated. Professor Jaffa teaches that they are complicated, but it is the function of the people who have the capacity to investigate those complications, to defend those simple things that are true, that my mother and father thought were true. It's my teacher, Harry Jaffa.
Thank you, Larry. Well, this is an unusual occasion for several reasons. The title of the talk that I have in front of me now is Our Embattled Constitution on Constitution Day 2001. But this is 2003. What happened in between? Most of you here are probably much too young to remember a time when the Catholic Legion of Decency ruled Boston. But there was a time when it was every publisher's ambition to have his book banned in Boston. Well, that was not an option for me, but I did the next best thing, or maybe something better. I was banned in Hillsdale. However, it may be that the time is riper now than it was then. So I'll read this speech because I wrote it 2 years ago, or a little more than 2 years ago, and I know that what I've written down is what I should say, or that I thought I should say, but I'll interrupt my reading with some comments which I think may make the text more alive than it otherwise would be. The unique power of the Lincoln theme, is suggested by the fact that it has occasioned more titles in the world's libraries than any other name. For some time it has been one of the three most numerous, the other two being Jesus Christ and William Shakespeare. Recently it has surpassed the others. This is even more remarkable when one considers the comparative shortness of time since Lincoln's life as compared to Jesus Christ and William Shakespeare. It's also remarkable that Alan Guelzo, in his 1999 book, Abraham Lincoln, Redeemer President, declared that Crisis of the House Divided, that was my book on the Lincoln-Douglas debates, published in 1959, was, quote, incontestably the greatest Lincoln book of the century. I hasten to point out that this is not a consensus view, but as Thomas Aquinas would say, what is evident to the wise is not evident to all. Whatever the rank of Crisis, it is now supplemented by its sequel, A New Birth of Freedom, Abraham Lincoln and the Coming of the Civil War. What is unique about both books in the Lincoln literature is that I have taken Lincoln's teaching about the Declaration of Independence as Lincoln himself regarded it, as a standard not merely for Lincoln's time, but for all time. I have done this not merely as agreeing with Lincoln, but as a matter of demonstrable philosophic truth. When I began my work on the Lincoln-Douglas debates in 1946, there had never been any attempt to describe or analyze the arguments put forth in those debates. To the historians, they were merely links in the chain of causes that brought Lincoln to power. The scholarly consensus then was that the Civil War came about because of unscrupulous politicians on both sides of the slavery issue seeking political advantage, who had inflamed public opinion until compromise became impossible. Of all those who rose to power by exploiting the slavery question, the most prominent was Lincoln. He was regarded simply as the most successful of the unscrupulous. My book, I must say, is in the sense in which I'm explaining it now, the first book on Lincoln which was favorable to Lincoln. Despite Lincoln's great reputation and veneration and the Lincoln in the Greek temple in Washington, the literature on Lincoln has not been favorable to Lincoln. Douglas, his opponent in the 1858 senatorial contest, tried vainly, it was said by the historians, to dampen the passions over slavery by his doctrine of popular sovereignty, by letting the people of each territory decide for themselves whether or not to have slavery among their domestic institutions. The slavery question would be confined to the territories and kept out of Congress. And I say in my book on the Lincoln-Douglas debates, I presented the case for Douglas himself, I think more powerfully than any of the people who were pro-Douglas, because it was a real alternative. It was thus, that's to say, the slavery question would thus cease to agitate the nation as a whole. Douglas, by ignoring or denying the immorality of slavery, was seen as the more moral of the two. He was thus a model statesman, someone who could calm the turbulent waters. This was the view of Lincoln dominant before the publication of Crisis of the House Divided. In 1946, the prevalent academic view of moral questions was that they were insoluble by reason. By considering slavery a question to be decided by self-interest rather than morality, Douglas was thought to be actually on the side of morality. By so doing, he made the uncompromisable compromisable. Lincoln, by insisting that the moral condemnation of slavery had to be the basis of all public policy concerning it, was held to be a herald of unreason, of passion, and of war. I believe I was the first, and in a sense remain the only one, to defend Lincoln on Lincoln's own ground. I have done so by taking the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence, as did Lincoln, as assertions of right reason and not of opinion merely. And I have maintained with Lincoln that right reason, no less than Scripture, is the voice of God. According to Lincoln, those who would deny freedom to others could not, under a just God, long remain in possession of their own. When Lincoln said that, as he would not be a slave, so he would not be a master, he was saying neither more nor less than Jesus when he said, "Whatsoever you would that others do unto you, do you unto them." Prophecy was with us then, it is with us yet, if we would hear it. Academic opinion on the rationality of morality has become much worse in the 40 years since Crisis. Campuses across the country are in the grip of something called political correctness. A main feature of PC is something called cultural relativism, or diversity. Since we are not supposed to really know right from wrong, we show our sophistication by patronizing indifferently the different concepts of right and wrong as they manifest themselves in different cultures or different ways of life. Unfortunately, some cultures celebrate, among other horrors too numerous to mention, human sacrifice, sati, cannibalism, and slavery. So political correctness arbitrarily rules out those cultures it does not like, and morality becomes a matter of what you like. Since reason is held to be impotent, it is replaced by passionate commitment, as it was in the Third Reich. Theoretical indifference thus mutates into blind partisanship. We see the effects of this all around us. Perhaps it is most conspicuous in heterosexual and homosexual promiscuity, and in general in the disintegration of the monogamous family. We see it as well in the rise of an environmental movement which, like communism, claims the authority of a spurious science as a means to despotic control of our lives. But the bad news is not only from the campuses. My 1994 book, Original Intent and the Framers of the Constitution, and my 1999 book, Storm Over the Constitution, record the complete alienation of conservative jurisprudence from the principles of the founding and of Abraham Lincoln. The classic text in this regard is the following. If a democratic society adopts a constitution, this is now a quotation from a great authority who I will identify in a moment. If a democratic society adopts a constitution and incorporates in that constitution safeguards for individual liberty, these safeguards do indeed take on a generalized moral rightness or goodness. They assume a general social acceptance, neither because of any intrinsic worth, nor because of any unique origins in someone's idea of natural justice, but instead simply because they have been incorporated in a constitution. The foregoing is from Chief Justice Rehnquist's celebrated essay on the notion of a living constitution. The contemptuous reference to, quote, someone's idea of natural justice is all the consideration he gives to the Constitution of Madison, Jefferson, Marshall, and Lincoln. This reflects as well the dominant irrationality of the academic climate within which Lincoln historians and American historians generally have pursued their vocation. Consider the implications of what the Chief Justice has asserted. If safeguards for individual liberty do not have any intrinsic worth, then neither does individual liberty, nor individual life. This is pure nihilism, the illusion of morality, and it is here regarded only as an illusion, has as its cause nothing but the will of the people who have adopted it. Now, the Constitution of 1787, besides safeguards of individual liberty, had safeguards of slavery. These were adopted by the same people at the same time, and hence on Mr. Justice Rehnquist's premises, these safeguards of slavery took on the same generalized moral rightness or goodness as the safeguards of liberty. It is also exactly the position of the seceding states in 1860 and 1861. By slavery to be a moral wrong, the Republican Party, they contended, had violated the consensus by which the Constitution had been ratified and the Union formed. This was the position against which Lincoln had to contend. So it's interesting that the present Chief Justice has stated exactly the position of the seceding South. How can any people, adopt a constitution? It must be by some electoral process. In that electoral process, must there not be freedom of speech and of the press and of the people peaceably to assemble? Must these rights not be recognized beforehand for the election to have any validity? Must it not be recognized a priori that the majority has no right to decide how the citizens may worship their God? Must it not be understood a priori that the majority may not enslave or expropriate the minority or drive them into exile? The entire concept of legitimate majority rule is bounded on all sides by a priori reasons within which alone majority rule may be legitimized. The sum of all these a prioris is embodied in what the founders understood to be the social contract by which majority rule is authorized. Consent is given thereby not to the powers of government, but to the just powers of government. This also is Lincoln's teaching. On the other hand, Rehnquist's idea of unbounded majority rule, of unbounded popular will, is perfectly consistent with the plebiscite, which has been the instrument of legitimacy of tyrants, from Napoleon to Hitler and Stalin. Mr. Justice Scalia, following Mr. Justice Rehnquist, also declares, quote, that the whole theory of democracy is that the majority rules. That is the whole theory of it. You protect minorities only because the majority determines that there are certain minority positions that deserve protection. But what if the majority does not elect to protect minority positions, or that some minorities are protected but not others? In 1857, the Supreme Court, speaking through Chief Justice Taney, declared that majority opinion at the time of the ratification of the Constitution held that black men and women were, quote, so far inferior that they had no rights which white men were bound to respect, and that they might be reduced to slavery for their own benefit. The proposition that all men are created equal was not, he falsely asserted, understood to include black human beings. Now, Taney was wrong about opinion at the time of the founding, but it was certainly true on the eve of the Civil War that white majorities in most, if not all, of the slave states believed in the inferiority of Negroes and did not believe that Negroes, whether free or slave, were entitled to constitutional protection for their lives, liberties, or property. And it is precisely this point of view, whether he knows it or not, that Mr. Scalia endorses when he says that in a democracy, minorities depend upon the majority for their rights. Consider also how this view of minority rights would today justify ethnic cleansing, by which whole peoples are obsessed in the Balkans, in Africa, and in Asia. And let us not forget the role of know-nothingism in our own history. The struggle over the Constitution today is between those who believe in a, quote, living Constitution and those who profess their allegiance to a jurisprudence of original intent. If the former, that's those who believe in the living Constitution, the former think that the original Constitution is a mere legacy of a reactionary past, featuring slavery, the subjection of women, capital punishment, and economic and social inequality. Their Constitution is one in which a wise Supreme Court can order wise constitutional remedies for the endless list of alleged wrongs. Since there is no limit to what may be alleged to be wrong, there is no limit to what may be a constitutional remedy. This is unlimited government by a judicial oligarchy, a virtual negation of everything the founders believed. In substance, the jurists of this living Constitution have seceded from the Union of the founders as completely as did the slave states that formed the Confederacy in 1861. We can save the Constitution only by restoring to it a genuine jurisprudence of original intent. This can only be done, as Lincoln did it, by distinguishing the principles of the Constitution of 1787 from the compromises of the Constitution. Unlike William Rehnquist or John C. Calhoun, Abraham Lincoln believed that safeguards of individual liberty were indeed possessed of intrinsic worth. They were possessed of intrinsic worth because each individual human being was endowed by his Creator with unalienable rights. Without question, these principles condemned slavery. But slavery was deeply intertwined with the roots of colonial society and could not quickly or easily be extirpated. Slavery was perhaps the oldest institution of human society, next to the family. No attempt was ever made in the ancient world to abolish it, notwithstanding the importance of individual liberty to the greatest of the Greeks and Romans. The compromises with slavery in the Constitution of 1787 were means necessary for the ratification of the Constitution. And the ratification of the Constitution, even with its compromises, was morally justified because every alternative to the Constitution would have been far more favorable to slavery. We must remember that the Founding Fathers, like ourselves and every generation of mankind, was born into a world they did not make, yet no generation did more to remake the world for the better world they inherited. No generation did more to remake for the better the world they inherited. However impatiently and unhistorically we look upon our past, the 77 years that separate the Declaration of Independence from the Gettysburg Address, seen in the light of all human history, is a remarkably short time in which to have accomplished the great work of emancipation. Today, nearly every good thing that we enjoy, and nearly every good thing that the world enjoys because of us, we owe to the principles enshrined in our founding, the principles preserved by Abraham Lincoln. It is shameful that at the very moment when these principles are having their greatest success, we witness their abandonment. Nowhere is the genesis of this intellectual and moral breakdown more visible than in the scholarly writing on Abraham Lincoln. The logic of Lincoln's commitment to the principles of the Declaration of Independence has, however, never been refuted. It has rather been ignored, and that ignorance treated as if it were a refutation. Our opponents are, however, tied by interests that they cannot admit to arguments that they cannot defend. And the alienation of conservatives is not less than that of liberals. It is the struggle for truth will be hard, and the fight will not only be with the weapons of truth. The end of this deadly ignorance and alienation is not at hand. This is not the beginning of the end. It is not even the end of the beginning, but the battle has been joined.